Welcome back to another episode of the DDGeopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, today joined by JM back on the show and our guest host from the past, Tyler Pop. Tyler, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be back.
And our guest is Kit Klarenberg of the Gray Zone, and here to talk about 10 years later, revisiting the Maidan, which I do want to, Kit, how are you today? And let us know a little bit about what we're going to talk about.
I mean, I'm grand. I'm fantastic. I join you from Belgrade, which was the city that started it all in terms of color revolutions, of which Maidan was a very obvious example. As I said, we have a profusion of British peacekeepers, quote unquote, in an infestation, you might say, near our southern borders. So that's not good news at all, and none of us are at all thrilled about it. But it is what it is. So here we are.
Well, I'm glad you did bring up Serbia, because if we have time towards the end of the episode, I do want to talk about the interconnectivity of Kosovo, Donbass, and maybe even Palestine. So let's get started. If you could, maybe JM can help you as well. Maybe give a short recap to our listeners of the Maidan and kind of from the lens of what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the key thing from my perspective, and I might be wrong in this, but is the fact that if you actually look at who was involved in terms of orchestrating and leading these protests in Kiev, which started in late 2013, they were all funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Like, they were all in direct receipt of NED funding. What can we conclude from this? Well, they were acting on the direct orders of the US government. The individual who started the Maidan protests by posting about it on Facebook, and an individual called Mustafa Naim, I think that he's originally from Afghanistan. He'd been working for several years for a NED and USAID funded media outlet in Ukraine. And we know from assorted leaks that the NED specifically sponsors protests in target countries of interest, and then pays the people who organize these things, direct bribes. So that's something to reflect on. I remember this period very well. I have Ukrainian friends who were utterly convinced that this was a totally organic declaration of democracy and freedom, etc. And they were very resistant to any suggestion that this was due to Western meddling. 6 months before Yankovic was deposed as president illegally, the head of NED wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post in which he specifically stated that Ukraine is the grand prize in Russia's near abroad, the ambit of countries which are formerly comprised of the Soviet Union. Evidently, this was a long-term objective of the US and Britain. We'll get into that more later. But the entire purpose was to isolate Russia diplomatically and politically. Ukraine remained a close ally of Moscow, even following the 2004 Orange Revolution in the UN and other international bodies. The plan was to separate Ukraine from Russia in every way, and the means by which this was to be achieved was by sponsoring nationalist elements within the country. It is a state which has since 1991 and its independence has been split between a pro-Russian majority, actually, in the east versus a kind of nationalist pro-Bandera minority in the West, it has struggled with national identity. It struggled with the entire issue of statehood for, well, now 30 years plus. The Western role is very well evidenced. I've written about this, but the role of Britain, particularly in sponsoring nationalist elements in Ukraine, is basically unknown now. The Maidan coup came at quite an interesting time from the perspective of Western power, in the sense that the Obama administration was vehemently against sponsoring nationalist elements in Ukraine. As Obama stated himself, Ukraine is not a core US interest, it is a core interest of Russia's. Therefore, it would be wrong of us to intervene, and indeed, arm Azov and all these far right paramilitary groups. Britain was a key sponsor of all of those elements, and indeed was pushing for a virulently anti-Russian policy at the highest levels of the British and the American governments from the time this happened.
Interesting. So, when you look at the period prior to the actual ousting of Yanukovych, I remember seeing quite a number of videos with, at first it seemed to be fairly quiet protests. There wasn't a lot of violence, but it seemed to be steadily gaining momentum. I remember that they were even using tractors and other farm equipment to attack some of the government buildings in different areas within Ukraine and Kiev specifically. So, do you recall any, at that point in time, any evidence of actual involvement between foreign actors and Pravi sector or other groups that were involved in the coup itself?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that it's important to remember that, like, when the sniper massacres started, and this is in January, February of 2014, so nearly 10 years ago now. This was when the protests were running out of steam, and like even some mainstream media sources in the West were acknowledging that actually the support for joining the EU/NATO was a minority position. Based on polls, that slaughter was fundamental to the eventual coup. There were nationalist elements on the ground that said that they were going to kill Yankovic if he didn't flee office promptly, which is what happened. We have just had, and this has not been reported by a single Western media outlet, of course, the outcome of a very long, this is like 2-3 years, court case within Ukraine of attempting to determine who was responsible for the massacre of Maidan protesters in what was then called Freedom and is now called Maidan Square, near the Ukrainian Parliament building. As I say, it was ignored. This is the million-page, just quite extraordinary, really, judgment, which was reported in Ukrainian media as convicting 5 Ukrainian state policemen for killing, I think it's around 70 Maidan protesters. Actually, the contents of the judgment, which again have not been reported on at all in the Western media, concluded that the nationalist elements, and indeed shooters from pro-Maidan controlled buildings in that area, including Hotel Ukraina, were responsible for the killing. This is a very dark, open secret in the modern history of Ukraine, which is subject to a total blackout in the English language media. There are Georgian snipers who are tied to Georgian Legion, which has carried out all sorts of war crimes and murdered Russian prisoners of war since the start of the Russian invasion in February 2022, who've openly stated on camera that they were directed by British and American actors to massacre pro-Maidan protesters in order to overthrow the government in Ukraine. It's quite remarkable that there has been no acknowledgement of this in the English language media. Like Sergei Pashinsky, who was allegedly, according to people who claim to have been the shooters during this time, from, again, Maidan-controlled buildings, is now Ukraine's biggest arms supplier. Mustafa Naim, who I mentioned, is now in charge of Ukrainian reconstruction, which obviously means the black rockization of the entire country, the privatization, the destroying jobs, destroying like the entire country's welfare structure. It's very clear what the purpose was all along. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah. So when you look at, there was the overt U.S. interference by Vicki Nuland. She attended the protest. So there were other, foreign dignitaries who attended them as well, as they were calling it the revolution of dignity, right? And we could see the video happening right now.
Oh, Christ.
You don't love this?
It's one cookie for every 10,000 Ukrainians killed. I think that's the trade-off. It's the trade-off.
Yeah. So 50 cookies, roughly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I remember this so well from the time. People were really sold on it. I lost friends as a result of all this because they were utterly convinced that it was organic and that this was the Ukrainians vying for democracy. I think that the US role is very clear, even if the Western media is out on a limb to deny it. The role of Britain in all of this is not known at all. And I have investigations forthcoming with the Grey Zone and Mint Press on this subject. It's very, very, very clear that elements within British intelligence viewed Maidan as an opportunity to start a war with Russia. Ultimately, as a result of all of this, there was I mentioned this in my last appearance on your channel, so I'm sorry for repeating myself, but Integrity Initiative, which was a Foreign Office funded quote unquote counter disinformation effort, was heavily involved in trying to isolate Russia diplomatically. Its parent charity, which was called the Institute for Statecraft, has now been shut down because no one will go near it. In July 2014, on their own website, they published an essay by an individual called Victor Madeira, who is tied to MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, which openly laid out the blueprint for what was to come over the next few years. They explicitly stated that, well, if we isolate Russia diplomatically and economically, and politically, this will lead to war, which the West will inevitably win. When you exhaust all diplomatic options, what other option is there apart from war? They truly believed that the West would prevail in all this. And the head of the Institute for Statecraft, an individual called Chris Donnelly, a former NATO advisor, he's now involved in orchestrating the bombing of Kerch Bridge, amongst other provocative acts targeting Russia. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, it's interesting that you bring that up because the Integrity Initiative, a lot of people just sort of point at it and say, "Oh, they're manipulating things. They're manipulating social media. They're manipulating." But they don't really get into how pivotal that entire operation was for destabilizing not only Ukraine, but also providing a PR campaign that spans, social media, influencers, academia, also the regular media, and also films, television series, and it was targeting countries in the Baltics, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus region. They actually have ties directly to different Western media sources that are sort of fact-checking organizations within the EU and within these other foreign blocks that I just mentioned. So the Integrity Initiative, the Institute for Statecraft, was the largest source of vilification of Russia and removing support from traditionally, former Soviet states that are adjacent to Russia now. So, very, very important piece to bring up.
Yeah, and I think that it cannot be understated how significant and how influential this operation was. The apologists for all this try and downplay it, but really, its entire purpose was isolating Russia. So many groups that we heard an enormous amount about, in the media, as countering "quote unquote" Russian disinformation, like the Lithuanian Elves, which was allegedly a grassroots movement to tackle Russian fake news online. This all sprouted out of Integrity Initiative, and I mean, I mentioned
the Lithuanian Elves was somebody taking the piss when they did that. The Lithuanian Elves.
Yeah, well, it was meant to be a counter to Russian trolls, but
Lithuanian Elves. This is what they came up with. Lithuanian Elves.
To counter Russian trolls. I get the
but allegedly, but really their purpose was to much like NATO now, just attack anyone calling for peace online as a useful idiot of the Kremlin. And I mentioned this last time, but it bears repeating. To give you an example of the real world impact of Integrity Initiative's black propaganda, bearing in mind Integrity Initiative was staffed by former British military and intelligence veterans. They in late 2017, they flooded the European media and indeed social media with false claims that the Catalan independence movement was being run by Russia. This led to Spain, which had hitherto been a almost unique voice in the EU, calling for peaceful relations with Russia. It led it led Madrid to designate Moscow as a state threat. It also led to the cutting off Julian Assange's internet access in the Ecuadorian embassy because he tweeted extensively about the Catalan independence movement and brutal crackdown by Spanish police and security forces on that movement. They openly talk in their files about how, and which were not meant for public consumption, about how this is a real problem for us, trying to turn the Spanish government against Russia because they enjoy warm relations. They achieved that. And a very significant voice within the West that was calling for cordial relations with Russia suddenly became very, very anti anything like that. They did the same all over Europe, and they transformed domestic political events like Brexit or the election of Trump into attacks by Russia on the West, which led a significant proportion of these countries' respective populations to feel violated and angry and demand a government response. Again, they knew this would lead to war, and that was the entire point. It's spelled out. It was spelled out on their website 10 years ago that this is what they were trying to do. Of course, like if you look at what was happening in the months leading up to the Russian invasion, Russian officials were openly talking about the fact that they thought that a negotiated peace was possible. Meanwhile, since the invasion started, Angela Merkel, among other EU officials, former EU officials, have openly admitted that this was just a delaying tactic, and they were stalling for time in order to arm Ukraine because they thought an invasion was inevitable. My dear friend Arnaud Bertrand, who is a China advocate, has created a fantastic thread of people dating back to 1991 who forecasted a war between Ukraine and Russia if numerous questions raised by Ukraine's independence were not resolved. This was an easily predictable and widely predicted war that's transpiring now. Jens Stoltenberg admitted a few months ago that, well, Russia gave us a peace proposal in the summer of 2021, and we knew it would lead to invasion if we didn't sign it, and we didn't sign it. I mean, he was very proud of this. The families and children of the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have been killed, probably not so much. Since the start of this. So yeah, like these people are completely insane, and they had this view that the West would just inevitably beat Russia in a conflict, and they were openly asking for this. Not coincidentally, Chris Donnelly, who I mentioned, the head of Integrity Initiative, in internal discussions with some of his murderous clique, they talk about, the US is too cautious, Biden is too cautious, this needs to be countered at all costs. They, up to and including nuclear war, they wanted all-out conflict with Russia, which is a completely insane proposition. And he was calling for this in March 2014. He openly stated in a memo, Ukraine is a rabbit caught in the headlights. It needs to assert itself. It needs to destroy the Russian Air Force in Sevastopol. It needs to use Cold War era satellite weapons to take out Russian satellites. I mean, they don't care because they're not going to be affected by it. But Ukrainians were the pawns on the chessboard who were going to be sacrificed in order for the West to win a war against Russia. Now that hasn't worked out. They're looking elsewhere. They're looking at Israel. They're looking at the Balkans. As I said, we have an infestation of British peacekeepers now near our southern borders. The MI6 assets like Alicia Kearns have been talking up the alleged threat of Serbian aggression as justification for flooding the region with, again, quote unquote, peacekeepers. The obvious question is, who is the true aggressor here, really? The British think tanks like RUSI, which is funded by the British government, have been talking about the dire threat of Russian, quote unquote, destabilization in the Balkans. It's not Russian soldiers that are posted throughout Sarajevo. It's British soldiers. Who is actually stirring up trouble here?
Right. I believe getting back to the post Maidan and sort of the investigation that happened. There was a verdict recently, as we mentioned earlier, the trial that happened. But there was also a video of a leaked telephone conversation between the Estonian foreign minister, or one of their ministers anyway, and Catherine Ashton, who was discussing the various funding and things that happened post Yanukovych's ouster. But then they also mentioned that there was some worry on the part of different Ukrainian officials because why don't we play the video so you can hear it for yourselves?
All evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides. So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that has medical doctor, she can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition, that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened, so that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
Los francotiradores que
Yeah. So as you can see, there was some back channel talking about. So they knew even then, they're not going to be telling the people out of the loop, which would be the Estonian government, that was the subject of so much of the propaganda, the black propaganda, and the manipulation by the British government of the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians. They're not going to tell them that they were part of it. But as you can see there, it was being brought up to the British foreign minister at the time.
Well, actually, she was the equivalent of what Borrell is now, but she worked for the EU.
That's right. That's right.
Back in happier days that are now gone. I think my question though is the why. Why would the British government be interested in doing this?
Well, I mean, I think historically, even dating back to the 1800s, Tsar Nicholas and King George, they look identical. It's frightening how similar they look. Even then, when Queen Victoria was regarded as the grandmother of Europe because all of her relatives were on thrones throughout Europe, it was viewed as a major competitor. Sorry, London viewed Moscow as a major competitor. They call it the Great Game because Russian influence, quote unquote, in Afghanistan threatened British domination, not only of India, but also Central Asia. Central Asia is a key geopolitical hotspot, little understood. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, talks about how failing a major catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, the US would not be able to extend its tendrils into Central Asia. Following 9/11, regarded as a new Pearl Harbor, the US did set up a system of bases throughout Central Asia, which should tell you something. Russia was viewed then as a pliable country that still wouldn't yield. The Russian Revolution was anathema to British elites because it showed that peasants could overthrow their rulers. Britain led the invasion of Russia in 1919, what was called in the US Operation Polar Bear. They were very angry about this. Churchill openly stated his objective was to strangle Bolshevism in the cradle. So there is a long-term British hatred and anger towards Russia. This is summed up, again, Victor Madeira, who I mentioned. This was not for public consumption, but in a document that he authored not long after he called for diplomatic isolation and economic blockade and black propaganda campaigns targeting Russia, he authored an internal memo for the Integrity Initiative in which he explicitly stated that, well, Russians are not like normal people, and Russia is not a normal country, and they're not materialistic, and this is a problem. And Russia, it does not want to be a vassal. It uses its international clout to assert its interest. Britain is not happy about that at all. Since World War II, the core component of British thinking in terms of foreign policy has been the maintenance of the American empire in order to further British interests, because London well understands that without the US empire in a place of total domination, its relevance and its force projection and its power is drastically reduced. Therefore, it has a key interest in maintaining the US empire. I've made this point many times, but it bears repeating. London is viewed as, even by anti-war people, as a reliable American poodle that will say how high when it's asked to jump by Washington. This is true to an extent, but also within British thinking, there is a sense of, well, we can manipulate the US for our own interests. I'm about to report on declassified British Ministry of Defence files, where they openly talk about how we can use the US to invade Yugoslavia and quote unquote topple Milosevic. It's rarely spelled out that brazenly in the declassified paper trail, but they were just expecting it and also hoping that the US would commit hundreds of thousands of troops to invade Yugoslavia, and then it would be occupied, and this would then effectively be a British win achieved via American means. We hear a lot, quite reasonably, about how the US is fighting to the last Ukrainian in Kiev and elsewhere. Actually, the overall strategy for London is to fight to the last American. And they, as I say, they were fully expecting a Russian loss here and maybe the breakup of Russia. Donnelly has written extensively in the past 10 years about his hope that Putin will be deposed and Russia will be broken up into its constituent manageable parts. This hasn't happened, so they're looking askance elsewhere, trying to thinking, where else can we maintain the US empire? The Balkans is a very obvious candidate. As I say, we've had an influx of British soldiers. There are former intelligence operatives now in British Parliament openly condemning the US pursuing a warmer relations with Belgrade. They know that if the US pulls back, quote unquote, i.e., if there are no fires for the US to put out, this is bad for London. So they need to maintain those blazes and pour more petrol on them.
Interestingly, sorry, go ahead, Jam.
Oh, okay, yeah, but the thing that makes this rather interesting is that the Soviet Union was broken up and there was a overthrow of the Soviet system. So why are they still hung up about the Russian Revolution, especially when Vladimir Putin has made very clear that he doesn't like the Russian Revolution, and there has been a lot of hagiography in the past, especially 10 years, about Nicholas II in Russia. So what is the problem here?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious answer that these people are completely insane. I've read the private emails of people within Donnelly's clique. When news stories at the start of the invasion claimed completely ludicrously that Russian soldiers had never seen a toilet before, or they mistook a microwave for a safe because they'd never seen a microwave before, they believe this shit. Richard Dillov, the head of MI6, believes this stuff. They think it's credible. There is that aspect to it. But also as well, I just think historically, London cannot abide any country that stands up for itself. I mean, Serbia is a state that has historically favored anarchism. The start of World War One was the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Gavrilo Princip, who is quite rightly a hero in Serbia today. There are dioramas of him adorning the walls of many buildings throughout the city. He explicitly stated, well, we have to break up the Austro-Hungarian empire. Southern Slavs have to unite into a single state. Any dissent from global capitalism previously enforced by Britain, now enforced by the US, has to be opposed. But also, as well, there is an aspect of never forgetting insults to the crown. You know, as I say, at the start of the 20th century, every single European monarch was directly related to Queen Victoria. The Berlin Conference, which carved up Africa into chunks that the European powers, it's like Godfather 2, where they cut up the cake of Cuba. Like, you know, you'll take the gambling and the prostitution interests in the South, and a core motivation for that was that King Leopold and Kaiser Wilhelm were bitter that their families had empires and they themselves didn't. So yeah, I mean, I don't think this is forgotten. Any country dissenting from the US line in all matters is considered problematic. It's often forgotten that Russia in the late 1990s and the early 2000s actually was keen to go along with color revolutions. Milosevic, one of the reasons that Milosevic relented in Kosovo was because the Kremlin got in touch saying, we won't support you unless you back down. The Kremlin also signed off on the removal of Eduard Shevardnadze in Georgia after the Rose Revolution. They were keen to be a collaborative partner, and then you fast forward to Putin's, I think it was 2008 at the Munich Security Conference. He asked the very obvious question: well, we've bent over backwards for you as Western powers, and we're not getting anything out of it. And it's not enough for you. So, like, where is the line? Like, you know, we refuse to be vassals. Any dissent in a mafia system cannot be tolerated. And so, particularly given that these insane people view Russia as the core sponsor of liberation movements, such as the Palestinians, etc. You can't allow any dissent to be tolerated. Like, it needs to be punished, like in some way. As a country that has the military prowess, but also the economic independence to assert its interests, they don't fit easily into a US dominated and indeed led global system. This encourages other countries to potentially think about dissenting, which is just unconscionable from London's perspective.
Right, and when you see the way things have played out over the last couple of years, it really becomes very apparent that, at least to me anyway, I saw a lot of whenever the U.S. showed signs of hesitancy to forward the new Wunderwaffe weapons that Kiev requested, it always seemed that Britain took an opportunity to, sort of fan the flames and, sort of promote whatever it was that Kiev needed. And some of that was evidenced, I think, around the Nord Stream. Right after that happened, there was an awful lot of cheering going on and a lot of back and forth. Whereas the West, as far as the U.S. was concerned anyway, they were really downplaying. We don't know anything, right? And a lot of the Western states, such as Germany, played along, but I think British interests seemed to be quite happy with the way things were going on there. And if you look at historically, you spoke of the Great Game. Well, there is no other country that I can think of, even in Europe, that has played the spy game and the manipulation game of foreign governments as long as the Brits have. And they probably have the best spy system in the world, and they probably have the most soft power in the world, far more than the US does.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, it was really interesting. If you look at like so many conflicts, I mean, Syria is a very obvious example. Like there were British operatives on the ground from before the quote unquote revolution even started. And their entire purpose was to get the US involved. I think this crops up again and again in the documentary record. The US is viewed as this kind of lumbering. I mean, the Iranians probably have it right. Like they refer to the US as the Great Satan, and Britain is the cunning fox by its side, just this like conniving little shit. And I mean, this is true, you know, and I think that yes, the British think that they are much smarter than the Americans, and that they can just manipulate Washington into doing their own bidding. Over and over again, this is proven to like not be the case. It was even openly reported in by the BBC that British government officials were worried about the quote unquote caution of the Biden administration. For all Biden's many faults, I think that he well understands that, like, actually, aside from all of the propaganda about how this has been really embarrassing for Russia, you know, from day one, the US Army would get absolutely slaughtered in a direct confrontation with Russia, leaving aside any consideration of the fact that like nukes are involved. Again, these people are insane. They have hugely inflated senses of their own importance, of their own strength, of their own force projection capabilities. They genuinely thought that Russia was just going to collapse as a result of sanctions, and then there could be a mopping up operation, and it could be carved up into, again, yes, like, you know, along mafia lines. In Syria, we see over and over again British operatives at the forefront of trying to sell chemical weapons attacks, which were staged by British assets on the ground, as they're trying to frame them as, well, this is grounds for war. The US pulled back because I strongly suspect that they knew exactly what the British were doing in Duma and Ghouta and all these other places where there were alleged government chemical weapons attacks. There is this sense of, well, okay, well, you can come and help me now. The Britain's new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, was blamed directly by a parliamentary inquiry for the total disaster of post-war Libya. There were, again, British assets on the ground from before the, again, quote-unquote revolution started. Their strategy of going around the world starting fires in the hope the US will either extinguish the flames for them or pour on more petrol as British interests require, it's not working anymore. Again, like this is why Alicia Kearns was trying to stir up trouble in the Balkans, because the Kosovo as an independent state was supported by the British as a means of destabilizing the wider Balkan region. It was a pet project of the Clintons and subsequent democratic administrations. Not so much now. Biden was moving towards Belgrade being its closest ally in the region. This is not good for Britain. When there are no problems to fix, Britain's made rather irrelevant. This was the basis of the Cold War. Churchill gave a speech in I think it was 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, which is known as the Sinews of Peace speech, where he mints all of these phrases about the need for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and the US and this Iron Curtain which has descended across Europe. At the time, the American public wasn't interested. They viewed the Soviet Union as a much closer and more reliable ally and friend than Britain. Within that context, Britain is relevant. towards the end of the World War II, Britain was being cut out of discussions about the shape of the post-war world. Roosevelt envisaged a system of spheres of influence whereby the US would have hegemony and domination over the Americas, and the Soviet Union would have the same over Europe. Of course, in that context, a tiny island with a relatively tiny population is irrelevant.
To bring us back then perhaps to the beginning of what we brought up about the Maidan verdict, because as you've been covering at the Gray Zone, as others who've been he is really our I don't want to use a cringe Japanese anime term, so I'll instead just say he's our great inspiration, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, all the way back in late 2015, piecing this all together from widely disparate sources to show exactly what this judgment showed, which is that at least 8 of the demonstrators were killed from the conservatory and the Hotel Ukraina, which were controlled by Maidan security forces or volunteer formations, depending on however they wanted to phrase it. And those same volunteer formations later became the far-right formations that we all know and love. What purpose then did it serve for them to kill their own people?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the Maidan was actually running out of steam when this happened. So there was they were violent from the word go, but the initial uprising, if you want to call it that, was it had ceased to be a subject of interest for the media, and it was just a bit like, well, I mean, I saw this from pro-Ukrainian sources at the time. It's like, well, we're in the square, like, what happens next? That Yankovic had beaten that parliamentary vote on his continued presidency. There are several, as I said, Georgians who are tied to Georgian Legion. I mean, just scum of the earth, who claimed that they were told to go to Kiev, and their purpose was to, quote unquote, stir up trouble. It was to inflame tensions, and I mean, in the manner of Operation Gladio, just get people angry. I mean, this is a common feature of CIA regime change operations. The same thing happened in Venezuela in 2004 when there was an attempted coup of the elected president Hugo Chavez. What's really interesting is in 1991, in Lithuania, an individual called Audrius Butkevičius, who was tied to the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense at the time, and now, funnily enough, is a very close ally of Chris Donnelly. He openly admitted that in January 1991, this is not long after a referendum in which the overwhelming majority of inhabitants of the Soviet Union voted to preserve the Soviet Union. He directed, by his own admission, the anti-Soviet protesters in Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, into the line of sniper fire. He has since repudiated those remarks and claimed that he was misquoted, etc. I mean, this is a student of Gene Sharp, who was a US regime change specialist and heavily inspired all of the color revolutions in the former Soviet sphere following 2000. At one point, Butkevičius referred to Gene Sharp's writings as more impactful than a nuclear weapon, or words to that effect. That sniper massacre popularized, mainstreamized, I'm coining a phrase there, opposition to Lithuania being part of the Soviet Union. Lithuania thereafter became a kind of central hub for anti-Russian agitation in Central and Eastern Europe. There was a writer called Galina Sapchikova who wrote a book called The Lithuanian Conspiracy, kind of mapping out all of this stuff. She got her door kicked down by Lithuanian security services in 2018. She had to flee the country. Her book was banned. It's called The Lithuanian Conspiracy. It's well worth a read. It's based on primary source interviews with the key players. She got chased out of the country, and to this day, Lithuania is very keen to shield this history because they have a national creation myth of passive, non-violent resistance to Soviet rule, when the reality is it was false flags that led Lithuanians to reject being part of the Soviet Union. So they have every interest in massacring their own people. I would also reiterate, I've made this point many times, in respect of Bucha, which we now have confirmation on record from multiple sources that Bucha was weaponized and exploited by the British in order to keep this war, keep the war in Ukraine going. If it's the case that Russia massacred innocent unarmed civilians, and the Ukrainians just moved in after the Russians left and found these corpses in the street, it is the only time since February 2022 that the Russians have done anything like this. It's also the only time since the invasion started that the Ukrainians haven't, and just to reiterate, haven't massacred people they considered to be quote unquote collaborators. I mean, there are UN reports documenting how teachers in Russian occupied areas who continued teaching their classes because they saw it as their moral and patriotic duty have been subject to torture, arbitrary detention and prosecution. Accepting bread from Russian soldiers is enough to justify, from the perspective of Kiev, slaughter. So actually, it's not quite so unimaginable. And if you wanted to carry out a regime change operation, and the ground effort, if you want to call it that, had kind of run out of steam, inflaming demonstrators with this notion that they are being killed by authorities is absolutely ideal. A better question is, well, why would the Yankovic government do this? They were actually in a very good position at that time. It was the massacre of 70 Maidan protesters that made Yankovic's ouster a fait accompli, because then, funnily enough, nationalist elements then began saying, well, if he doesn't leave, then we're going to murder him. It further inflamed crowds who, yes, had lost momentum over the previous few weeks. There was no reason for this to happen from the perspective of Kiev at the time.
Is there any information that you can give us that we sort of haven't seen to date anywhere, or any sort of a timeline or piece of evidence that you could share with us that maybe shows a little bit more of the collusion between the U.S. and Britain and the interference there with the Yanukovych government and the Maidan protests? Is there any sort of anything we haven't seen so
smoking
far?
gun. I mean, in terms of the smoking gun, something that really jumps out to me is that one of the individuals in Audrius Butkovicius's orbit, who is tied to the Institute for Statecraft, he stated on his LinkedIn that he was involved in he calls it protection of the Institute for Statecraft during 2014 in Ukraine. So that means that their operatives were on the ground when this is happening. When the Odessa massacre occurs, when MH17 occurs, shockingly, and very few people know this, there were British assets on the ground who even filmed the crash of MH17. I think it was August or September of 2014 when that happened. So yeah, I mean, a black and white document suggesting that the British were involved with nationalist elements at this time on the ground in Ukraine is unforthcoming. It is extremely likely that this won't have been committed to paper. This is probably why it was farmed out. Responsibility for this was farmed out to the Institute for Statecraft in the first place as a kind of arm's length state operation. I mean, look at the history, though. I mean, Stefan Bandera, the CIA refused to work with him because they thought he was too extreme. MI6 had no such qualms about using him as an asset. This is again clear from the US documentary record. The Forest Brethren, the anti-Soviet resistance fighters who lived in the forests of the Baltics and carried out sabotage, etc., they were being run by the British. The British minted a model which was the foundation of Operation Gladio, as I referred to previously, in which the far-right violent elements were given funding and training and money in order to carry out, in order to create chaos. Again, this is the British doing this. As I say, the US had no appetite for dealing with Bandera, and they were telling their counterparts in London, well, I mean, he's like some insane neo-Nazi nationalist. They didn't care, and I think that it's important to consider the history here, that the US and Britain, but particularly Britain, has been sponsoring violent nationalism in Eastern Europe for decades in order to destabilize Russia, or so they hope. We can look at the British Foreign Office, i.e. British intelligence funding of anti-government media outlets in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. The explicit purpose is to, quote unquote, weaken the Russian state. Whoever and whatever will fulfill that objective, they are happy to send money and directives to. I think it's important to note as well, in Russia itself, there are leaked files which are in the public domain, which indicate that that Britain had a secret network of YouTubers it used to perpetuate particular propaganda messages. London's relationship with these people was quite so intensive it necessitated, quote unquote, daily management, and they boast in internal files of having activists at the forefront of protests in Moscow, and this generating a wide variety of content that was then recycled by the BBC and other outlets. We've heard a lot about Russian meddling and disinformation and skullduggery in Europe and the US. Nothing like that has ever emerged. It's very, very clear that the British are taking a lead on this, that they are hoping the US follows suit. They are willing to engage in active measures to try and get Washington on board with what they're doing. It's really quite remarkable. And as I say, the Maidan came actually quite inconveniently in terms of its timing from the perspective of the US, because, as I say, the Obama administration was against war in Ukraine. You had individual actors like John McCain, may he burn in hell, who were openly stating, "Oh well, the Ukrainians' fight is our fight," and encouraging Ukraine to go to war with Russia. The actual government position at that time, in terms of Washington, was no further. Russiagate, which Integrity Initiative helped kickstart, I mentioned this last time, but it bears repeating. In October 2016, there is an internal Institute for Statecraft memo where they state, we can't rely on US support anymore, and Trump is a real threat to that. And so unless a catastrophe happens to wake people up, quote unquote, we will have to create some of our own. Russiagate was a very clear example of that. There were British operatives directly tied to Integrity Initiative were at the forefront of it, and yeah, like they were pushing for this, and the inevitable and indeed desired upshot of it all was that Trump was bounced into tearing up Cold War arms control treaties and arming Azov and engaging in all sorts of incendiary, provocative actions, which Obama had refrained from. This is a direct result of the British creating a trap for him to fall into, for him to prove his anti-Russian credentials. Yeah, like it is very striking to me that we see in the leaked files that we've reported on the Grey Zone, that the people like Chris Donnelly were very unhappy with the fact that Biden wasn't giving Kiev nukes, for instance, or they openly state, yeah, the US reluctance or hesitancy has to be opposed at all costs in every way. Like, yeah, they really thought this was going to lead to all out war. And the West would prevail, and we're seeing now, as we hopefully reach the end of this, and Ukrainians stop getting killed in absolutely vast numbers on a literal daily basis, that this hasn't worked out. They've now shifted their focus. There are other pawns on the chessboard to be deployed.
So, question, between your research and the new verdict with Professor Kachanowski, what does it mean for today, if anything? Does it change anything about the conflict, the SMO? Does it, I mean, Ukraine's already kind of declining in the public eye, so that's not really a thing, but what does it change in terms of anything for Ukraine and Russia?
I don't think it changes anything particularly, actually. Like, I mean, it's just it's a testament to how an enormous amount of deeply incriminating information is published on an almost daily basis, and then it's just forgotten about. And like, yeah, as I said, like media outlets, including Reuters, which I've exposed for the Grey Zone as being happily in bed with British intelligence, they misreported the findings. I mean, they used the language, a sentence has been passed down in the prosecution of 5 Ukrainian police officers for the Maidan massacre. What they mean by that is that 2 serving police officers were exonerated and 3 tried in absentia, who were eagerly handed over by the Zelensky government, were convicted when they didn't offer a defense and they didn't represent themselves or have anyone representing them in court. I don't think that there is any change. It has been, yes, studiously ignored by the Western media. I think that an enormous amount of facts could come out still. Russia has been talking a lot about biolabs in Ukraine. This has just been rejected as Russian quote unquote disinformation. But it's certainly fascinating because, I mean, this is again a core part of the modern Ukrainian state's creation myth. Likewise, Odessa, where there are significant efforts to frame this as Russia deliberately killing its own people to blame on Ukraine, which doesn't really make very much sense. Yeah, like Dr. Ivan is the sole source talking about this in public. The entire Western media just ignores it. The control of Kiev over the flow of information is absolutely massive. There was a rather embarrassing, actually, interview with on, was it CNN, with Zelensky recently, where he stated very, very brashly, "Oh, I have so much power, as president." Yeah, he does, and Hello, sorry
Yeah.
about that. Yeah, I
No, you're
dropped
fine.
out. But like he is able to put a block on the flow of damaging information, very, very, very effectively. Numerous press freedom organizations have openly condemned Kiev's crackdown on the media. It's gotten no coverage. It's been completely ignored. So I mean, we shall see. The new strategy for weaponizing the war in Ukraine from the West perspective is just to ignore what's going on. The Russians are close to breaking through in numerous areas. This is not getting reported on. So yeah, I don't think it necessarily does change anything. But like, I mean, maybe in 10 or 20 or 30 years time, when we start getting declassified documents on this released, if they are even then, if not 100 years, maybe the conversation will change. In the meantime, I have zero optimism. I tweeted about this yesterday. The media has consistently framed unambiguous signifiers of catastrophic failure as success. Nicholas Kristof, a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times regime change activist, he in the summer wrote about how Ukraine is winning because they have tens of thousands of amputees. He openly stated that, well, like one of the benefits of being, having your legs and arms blown off is that you can get laid. In Ukraine, I mean, it's absolutely staggering. We've seen this since the very start. When Kiev handed out instructions for making Molotov cocktails, videos of Ukrainians throwing it completely ineffectually Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks was framed as heroism and a victory. These people setting themselves on fire and the total lack of impact on their targets is kind of unmentioned. Pensioners enlisting in the army is skewed as a victory when actually it's just really bleak. Women enlisting in the military or being conscripted in the military is spun as a victory. The videos which are now circulating on certain areas of Telegram of women dead, like on the front lines, are not spoken about. It's been quite some war, actually.
Well, and you brought up one thing in the beginning about Serbia, kind of this volatile pivot point in Kosovo. And then we discussed the Ukraine, Donbass, another pivot point. How do you kind of see the information that we talked about today and the new revelations in the Maidan? Do you see any parallels or similarities to what's happening right now in Palestine?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think that what was really striking to me was that Robert Peston, who was an establishment client journalist in Britain of the absolute highest order, he, within 24 hours of Operation Al-Aqsa flood starting, stated that based on anonymous British intelligence sources who'd told them out of the goodness of their hearts that this was the start of another major war. I think that the total shift of focus towards Gaza is very good for all concerned, because it means that yes, the catastrophic situation in Ukraine is shunted off headlines, and the media doesn't have to endure the awkward experience of admitting that everything they've been reporting for the past the past year and a half has been abject lies. Like the British and the Americans are backing a proxy, i.e. Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's government. It's going spectacularly badly for them. If you see casualty figures, the Israeli occupation forces are being killed in vast numbers. This is not being talked about. I mean, very oddly, all of the OSINT people who were testifying to Russian failure every day from the start of the invasion have gone eerily quiet. An account called Oryx on Twitter, which was the basis of British Ministry of Defence public declarations about the scale of Russian losses, has mysteriously vanished from the internet, and it's no longer cited. So, I mean, yeah, like I strongly suspect that that London is hoping that this will be the start of war with Lebanon and Iran. But just as with Ukraine, I think that they are delusional about who the ultimate victors will be.
Well, I think we've reached like a total of an hour. What else do we need to touch on here? Tyler, JM, Kit.
Well, just in that same vein, you spoke about Lebanon, you spoke about other actors in the region and the potential for war with them. We just saw today, yet again, Syria's airport, the civilian airport, was attacked in Damascus, and we've seen sort of what is it? 4 countries now have been attacked by Israel since October 7th. And we've seen an awful lot of the same sort of propaganda tactics that were taking place in Ukraine are now taking place inside of Israel and what's happening with the Gaza Strip and their attacks against the Gazans. So do you think that, from what I'm seeing anyway, is that there's an abject failure in the propaganda on the part of the West to contain the information that's getting out, and also to get that information, their talking points out there in a way which is believable? Because I think there's a stark difference between the way people have supported Ukraine up until this point, and then from the way that there's been this huge backlash against Israel. Some people claim it's because of anti-Semitism, but I think it's other factors that have led to this a massive stream of support for Palestinians in places where I frankly don't think the West expected it.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing how Britain and America respond to their total control of the narrative being challenged, which is to start locking people up. There are some communist publishers in the UK who had their front doors kicked in at 3 a.m. by British police for publishing pamphlets documenting the sordid history of Zionism's dark handshake with Nazism. I think that it's spinning out of control from the perspective of London and Washington. Like people having dissenting opinions, and then in that context, their only response is arrests, jailing, and censorship. It's not going well, and I think that what's really interesting, a new NATO Stratcom report just dropped, which was effectively endorsing cyberbullying as a strategy against people that whose opinions NATO does not like, while decrying anyone responding to those kind of tactics. I mean, there's a whole case study about NAFO within it. They cling to this idea, particularly in London, due to London's rather foreshortened force projection and military and intelligence capabilities following the end of World War II. There is this willful self-delusion that information war is the most important theatre in which to win. By that, they obviously mean deluding and confusing and misleading their own population. The social media, for all of its many evils, is very effectively countering all of that, and they don't know how to respond. In my case, I'm under criminal investigation for factual investigative reporting. I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot of people ending up in jail for expressing the wrong opinions online. I was stopped under a piece of counter-terror legislation, which states that someone can be a state threat operating on behalf of a hostile foreign power without them or the hostile foreign power in whose interest they are serving knowing. And this has been reinforced by the new National Security Act, which got zero critical coverage in the media. And yet there are British government lawyers who have openly stated this is going to have like a real chilling effect, and you need to be like journalists need to be like really careful about what they talk about, because they will end up in jail, as a result. I think as long as Western audiences, or at least a component of Western audiences, are sufficiently delusional, this is considered a sufficient win from London's perspective, and also Washington. It is very difficult to keep a lid on the fact that the biggest protests in British history are now transpiring every weekend in London and other major cities within Britain. I was, albeit tangentially, involved in organising protests around Operation Gladio, which was Israel's genocidal strike against Gaza in 2014. We managed to attract tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. The protests are even bigger now. As I say, it's spun out of control, and Western authorities have no response. In Germany, it's a lot easier to get away with criminalizing people saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In allegedly free US and Britain, not so much. So what the next few weeks, if not months, will hold, it isn't certain. If there is a positive to draw from this, it's that Europe's credibility in the global south is now permanently finished. It's over. And there was some interesting reporting, again based on anonymous sources, that European officials were well aware of this. By backing Israel's genocide in Gaza, they would have no credibility or sympathy in the global south, but they just went ahead with it anyway. I think that's a you can't fire me, I quit type situation. They knew that their brand, for want of a better word, was damaged in those regions. And so now they're pretending it doesn't matter, when it really, really, really does. And again, we see this with the war in Ukraine. 85% of the world has not moved to sanction Russia or take punitive measures against Russia. In fact, even the Spectator in Britain has acknowledged that Russia's standing in the third world has increased as a result of the conflict, and its connections and allies in Africa and Asia are increasing by the day. Everything has gone wrong. From their perspective, there should be no self-reflection of that. I am completely certain. But it does mean, I think, again, rather encouragingly, that their only response to all of these headwinds is to just keep doing the same in the hope that it will one day work. And it's demonstrably not.
Well, you touched on something, and now I have a final question. So you talked about fascism literally in the UK. We've seen it. We've seen the pushback. About 300,000 people protested yesterday. It almost got up to 1 million one day, I think. We've gone through the Nazi celebration in Canada. We've gone through the normalization of fascism in the United States. We've gone through the normalization of the fascist state of Ukraine. And now we have always had the normalization of the fascist state of Israel. So and now it's kind of trickling out and seeping out into places like the UK, Germany, that sort of thing. So as a journalist and as a political expert, we are now in the highest stages of capitalism in crisis. How much further can this really go? Are we looking at complete media silence, radio silence, while we just make our descent into the inevitable fascism? Or what are we doing here? What is really going on? And how much further does it go before something has to give?
Well, I mean, I saw someone the other day use the rather beautiful phrase that we're living through the birthing pains of a multipolar world. And I think that, there will likely, in the very near future, be a total shut-off of information flow between the West and East. Again, as I say, I strongly suspect that Britain and America will just keep doing the same thing because they don't understand how to do anything other. This developments in the world potentially will come thick and fast, and it will come as news to a lot of people. The Saudi-Iran rapprochement, as brokered by China this summer, which is a hugely significant thing, it got zero coverage in the West at all. And there were friends of mine in West Asia who were convinced initially that it was a meaningless, forceless agreement conducted for political reasons by Tehran and Riyadh. Actually, it's hugely significant. And again, this is why independent media, which tells you not only a different side of the story, but an entirely different story from the ground up, is considered so dangerous. There will be a lot more open censorship. I think a lot more people will start questioning why they're being lied to on a consistent basis by every organ of civil society, whether that's think tanks, NGOs, media outlets, or yes, like the government. Marx talked about how capitalism contained within its foundations the seeds of its own destruction. I think that what Western powers are doing now is sowing seeds of their own destruction, and they kind of know it, but they just want it to not be true. And so from their self-absorbed, perhaps psychopathic perspective, it isn't, but like actually the real world impact is massive. I don't expect anything particularly pretty to come out of this in terms of the Western world. I mean, in Britain, it's like outright fascism now. I mean, they're not even bothering to hide it. I know people personally who have been approached by the police for flying Palestine flags on their property. They've gotten a knock or a letter telling them to not do that because it's a signifier of extremism. Go on.
No, I was going to ask, I thought you had finished. I was going to ask you if you noticed, because you live in a European state that's outside of the EU, Serbia, do you notice any changes or a market not changing in accordance with kind of the EU's like swerving into fascism? Like, is Serbia also along the ride, or because they're not part of the EU, they kind of get to like take a step back?
Well, I mean, very interestingly, like support for joining NATO and the EU in Serbia, which was already like ridiculously low for very obvious reasons, is now even lower. I think it's like 90% of the public oppose joining NATO and 70% of the public opposed joining the EU. I mean, we did nonetheless roll out the red carpet for Jens Stoltenberg recently, and our president spoke about the need to restore lost trust on both sides. But I mean, I just Belgrade has at numerous points throughout the conflict in Ukraine been ordered by Berlin and London and other Paris, major European powers to pick a side at last and stop prevaricating and give up its neutrality. That hasn't happened. What is the proposition? I mean, Serbia already, despite not having sanctioned Russia, has some of the highest food inflation in Europe. Like, what's the appeal of joining the EU? Oh, like more of that? As long as you sanction Russia, I mean, my experience from people I know here of both the left and right is that they are happily bobbing along, but there is a sense of at some point the need to die on a hill is impending, but they're being very careful about what hill they do die on. There have been numerous attempts to trap or trick Serbians into engaging in fiery uproar. Earlier this year, there was a shooting at a school, which was horrific. Here, it was the first time in Serbian history this has happened, and the Western-backed opposition were trying to exploit this as a political issue. Most people I know here didn't go along with it. So, I mean, the efforts are still there, but I just think that, from the public's perspective at least, if not the government's, people are well aware that they are being sold false promises, or a house built on sand, as it were. So they're opposed to that. They might not be protesting every day. They might not be making a huge noise about it, but they well understand it, and they can see that they are better off out of these structures. Again, it goes back to Western delusion. It's like Germany is collapsing politically and economically. They've had a 1% drop in their GDP, and they're embracing AFD. It's that reflexive. The embrace of just something, anything different. Is it really that a compelling sales pitch? Like, oh yeah, be like us with our deindustrialized Rust Belt on the Rhine economy. Like, no, it isn't. Yes, as I say, like we shall see. The Chinese investment is increasing. We will, as of next year, have a direct train to Hungary, another relatively free state in Europe, which, according to the Pentagon leaks, is considered the US's chief enemy in the world. And that is a direct result of Comrade Xi. So I mean, yes, I think waiting and seeing is the sensible option.
Okay, well, Tyler, do you have any final thoughts or questions from Fascist Canada?
Oh, wow. Well, from Fascist Canada, all I can say is, we're very, very sad to have somebody like Justin Trudeau at the helm, leading us through all of these difficult times and failing miserably. Other than that, all I can say is thank you, Kit, for providing all of your deep insights into what's happening in the world today. Thank you, Sarah, for having me on. And thank you, JM. It's been a long time since we've been on stage together.
JM, are you there with us? Do you have any thoughts or questions from Fascist Britain? I don't think we have JM. He had to step out for our book club. That's what kind of nerds we are. And Kit, do you have any final thoughts from wonderful Serbia, Beograd?
I mean, nothing apart from God is a Serb. And I think, on that bombshell, we'll leave it. But God bless you. Thank you.
I think you just got our episode demonetized. That was the statement that got us demonetized. God is a Serb. Kosovo is Serbia. Palestine is Palestine, and Donbass is Russia. Thank you very much for joining us on another episode of the DDGeopolitics podcast. You can find us at ddgeopolitics.com, back on the spaces, on Rumble, on Substack with our new editor, Evan Reef, and 5 new writers working for you guys. There's an option to support there. Please like, share, and subscribe to YouTube. Thank you very much, Tyler. We will be back on Wednesday with a surprise guest. And thank you, JM and Area, once again.